This is for every daughter who was told her work was worthless, while her brother's dream got called the family's future. My name is Nora Bellamy. I'm 20 years old. 6 months ago, my father looked at the dress I'd spent 3 weeks hand embroidering and said, "You don't get a future, Nora. You get scraps. Sewing is what girls do when they can't do anything real." My mother laughed and added, "At least Tyler's going to actually be somebody." They didn't know my scraps had already made $34,000 that year. And they had no idea that the building their own hardware store had operated out of for 30 years didn't belong to the man whose name was on the sign anymore. It belonged to me. If this story is already hitting you somewhere personal, hit subscribe and drop where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment. Let me take you back to the night it all actually started, because what happened at my parents' 30th anniversary dinner didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for 4 years, one quiet stitch at a time, long before anyone in that family thought to ask what I was actually doing with all those hours upstairs. I grew up in Danville, Ohio, the middle child, between my older sister who'd moved to Denver years earlier and mostly stayed out of the family orbit, and my younger brother Tyler, 17, who pitched for the Danville Wolves and had since roughly aged 12 been declared the family's one shot at something. My father ran Bellamy Hardware on Main Street, a store his own father had started in 1961, leased for 3 decades from a rotating cast of landlords. None of us ever met in person. My father used to joke at every family dinner practically that the store had survived 3 recessions and 2 different landlord companies without ever once missing a rent payment, like the survival itself was the achievement, not the store. My grandmother Ruth Bellamy taught me to sew when I was 8 at her kitchen table using a thimble worn smooth from decades of use. "Small hands make big things," she used to say, if you're patient enough to let them. I heard that phrase probably 400 times growing up. I didn't understand yet how much weight it would end up carrying. Every Sunday from age 8 until I was 14, my parents dropped me at Grandma Ruth's house while they drove Tyler to travel league practice 2 counties over. I used to resent it, honestly stuck sewing while my brother got to run around a field with other boys who all seemed to matter more than I did. Coaches shouting encouragement, I never once heard aimed in my direction. It took years to understand what I'd actually been given instead. Grandma Ruth taught me French seams, then embroidery, then how to grade a pattern without losing its shape. She never once called sewing a hobby. She called it a trade, the same word she used for her late husband's carpentry, spoken with the same respect. She kept a button tin sorted by size on her windowsill, and she'd let me sort through it while she cooked, telling me the history behind each one, a coat from 1974, a christening gown she'd made for my own mother, a jacket she'd taken apart just to save the buttons. Nothing in that house went to waste, and I don't think looking back that she was only ever talking about buttons. Grandma Ruth died last March, sudden a stroke in her garden, the same garden where she used to hand me tomatoes still warm from the sun. At the funeral, my Uncle Pete pressed a sealed envelope into my hand, my name on it in her handwriting, and said, "Only she said you'd know when it was time." I put it in my jewelry box and didn't open it. Not yet. There was also a custodial trust my grandfather had set up for both grandchildren when we were born. $6,000 each meant to release for education at 18. When I turned 18 and asked about mine, my mother said the account had gone toward family expenses over the years, and that I'd understand once I was older. I didn't understand. I never got a real answer. I remember standing in the kitchen that day, asking 3 more times in 3 different ways, watching her find a slightly different way to avoid the question each time, and getting 3 versions of the same vague deflection. I stopped asking the way you stop knocking on a door that's never once opened, and started keeping my own careful records instead, just in case the day ever came when someone finally had to answer for it. By 16, I'd taught myself pattern making from library books. By 18, I was running an Etsy shop from my bedroom using a machine I'd bought with 3 summers of babysitting money, a genome I'd researched for months before I could finally afford it. My parents knew about it the way you know about a neighbor's garden, vaguely without curiosity. Meanwhile, Tyler got a $4,200 private pitching coach, a $2,900 recruiting video, a $3,800 travel league season new cleats twice a year, a $600 pitching sensor that tracked his velocity. When I asked at 17 about a $14,000 design certificate program in Columbus, my mother said, "That's not practical. We have to think about where the money goes." The money that, as it turned out, included $60,000 that had technically had my name on it since birth. I stopped asking. I started building instead in complete silence, the way Grandma Ruth had taught me to finish a hem so tight nobody could ever see the stitches holding it together. Have you ever watched your family fund one sibling's dream with money that was never fully theirs to spend? Sit with that question for a second, because I sat with it for 2 years before I had the proof to say it out loud. By 19, my shop had become Bellamy and Thread LLC, with a part-time seamstress named Carla, a retired garment worker with 30 years of factory experience who'd answered a small classified ad I'd posted at the community college and a small rented workspace above a bakery on Main Street. In the 18 months before that anniversary dinner, it did all $18,000 in revenue. Almost none of it spent all of it reinvested into better equipment craft market booths that sold out within hours and the workspace itself. Carla never once asked why my own family didn't seem to know the scale of what we were building together. I think she understood without needing it, explained that silence was sometimes the only tool available. In February, a retailer called Hearth & Row came calling. Their buyer, a sharp, direct woman named Priya Alawalia, eventually offered $34,000 to acquire the company outright, plus a design director role at $72,000 a year. She'd flown out in June to tour the workspace herself, running her fingers along a rack of finished jackets, asking pointed questions about my supplier relationships and per-unit costs, telling me my margins were better than most brands twice your size. I told her I'd think about it. I told my family nothing at all. I also, that same spring, finally opened Grandma Ruth's envelope. Inside was a short note, directing me to an attorney named Martin Osei in Millersburg, and nothing else. I called. He asked me to come in. Martin's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had gone cold on a warmer plate hours earlier. He had a framed photo on the wall of himself 20 years younger, shaking hands with someone at what looked like a bar association dinner. He slid a folder across the desk before he said much of anything the way people do when they want you to see the proof before you have to trust the words. "Your grandmother came to me 4 years ago," he said with 2 instructions. First, a $6,000 education trust for you, specifically separate from anything your parents managed, funded from her own savings, released the day you turned 20. He paused, watching my face carefully. Second, and she was very specific about the timing on this one, she purchased the commercial building at 214 Main Street in 2021. The building your father's store operates out of. I sat very still. "That's Bellamy Hardware." "She bought it through a trust in your name," Martin said. "Your father has been paying rent for 4 years to a holding entity he assumed was a distant landlord. He's never once met the actual owner. He's never once asked. I asked him why she'd never told anyone, why she'd let my father go on believing a stranger owned the building his own father had built the business inside of." Martin slid me a second page, a note in her handwriting, the same precise script I remembered from birthday cards. "I watched your father spend 30 years scared this store could be pulled out from under him by a stranger. I decided the person it should never be pulled out from under by was you. Don't use this to hurt him. Use it to finally be seen." I read that line 4 or 5 times before I could fold the paper back up. My parents' 30th anniversary dinner was set for late September at the VFW Hall. 31 guests, folding tables, a real bakery cake instead of a grocery store one. Tyler wore his jersey, because my father had asked him to, in case anyone from the Walensky family knows a scout. I wore a dress I'd embroidered myself, one I'd sold 4 times that spring for $340 each, the collar taking almost 11 hours of hand-stitching alone. At the head table, my father toasted Tyler as the future of this family, gesturing at the jersey, while my mother beamed beside him. Uncle Pete, 2 seats down, caught my eye like he already knew something was coming, which of course he did. Halfway through the meal, my mother's phone rang. Area code 216 Cleveland. She almost let it go to voicemail the way you do at a family dinner, but something made her answer. "Hello, yes. This is Denise Bellamy. A pause. Her face changed. Which daughter? Every head at that table turned toward me. My cousin Melissa, mid-bite of cake, froze with her fork in the air. I took the phone. This is Nora. Hi, Nora Priya Aluwalia. I apologize for calling during a family event, but our acquisitions team finalized their review today. We'd like to move forward, full buyout of Bellamy and Thread, $34,000 plus a design director role at $72,000 a year. 31 guests. Every fork frozen. I said I'd call her back tomorrow and hung up, setting the phone down carefully on the white tablecloth. What my father said was that was an offer to buy my company, I said. $34,000. It did $18,000 in revenue last year. I have an employee. I have a workspace. None of you know any of this because I stopped telling you things a long time ago. The table erupted into overlapping questions. Aunt Carol asked my mother if she'd known. My mother hadn't, or claimed she hadn't, her hands trembling slightly against the tablecloth. My father's face cycled through confusion, then something harder, more defensive, the look he got whenever a conversation started slipping away from the version he preferred. This is a hobby that got lucky, he said. You sow. You've always just sown. It's not luck, I said, keeping my voice level, even though my pulse was audible in my own ears by then. It's 2 years of reinvesting every dollar, working nights, teaching myself from library books, because you told me design school wasn't practical. Meanwhile, you spent thousands on Tyler's coach and his video and his cleats, and when I asked about my own trust fund at 18, you told me it had gone to family expenses. I could feel my hands shaking slightly under the table, and I pressed them flat against my knees to steady them before I kept going. The table went quiet in a different way now, the kind of quiet that has an edge to it. My mother's face went pale. Nora, that's not... I have the account statements, I said. Martin Osei pulled them for me last month because Grandma Ruth's estate required a full accounting before her separate trust could release. $15,400 of that account went into Tyler's baseball expenses over 4 years. Recruiting videos, camps, a private coach, travel league fees. Almost all of it, line by line, dated and itemized. Tyler's face went white, his fork clattering softly against his plate. Wait, that was your money? It was both our money, I said. Yours is still there. Mine isn't. Uncle Pete stood, pulled out the worn envelope from his jacket, and this time set it directly on the table, sliding it toward me with 2 fingers. There's more, he said. Nora, tell them the rest. About the building. I looked at my father, who was gripping his water glass hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. Bellamy Hardware. You've paid rent on that building for 4 years to a company called Millbrook Holdings. That's our landlord, my father said slowly. Like the words themselves might rearrange into a different, less frightening sentence if he said them carefully enough. We've never met them. Everything goes through a property manager. Millbrook Holdings is a trust, I said. Grandma Ruth bought the building in 2021. She put it in my name. I've owned the building your store operates out of for the last 4 years. And I only found out myself a month ago. The silence that followed had genuine weight to it. Aunt Carol's hand went to her mouth. My cousin Melissa actually gasped audibly, loud enough that a table near the back turned to look. My father sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, like a man trying to recalculate 30 years of his own life in real time and not liking any of the numbers coming back. That's not possible, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's in the county recorder's office, I said. Martin has the deed. He has the trust documents. He has your rent payment history for the last 4 years, all 48 payments, all going to an account you never once questioned. Martin Osei's phone call came next, right on schedule. Uncle Pete had arranged it in advance, the same way he'd waited to hand over the letter until exactly the right moment. He put it on speaker, setting the phone in the center of the table next to the half-cut anniversary cake. Good evening, Martin said, his voice calm and unhurried the way it had been in his office weeks earlier. I understand this has already been an eventful night. I wanted to confirm 2 things on record, now that Nora has disclosed what she's comfortable disclosing. First, the $6,000 education trust established by Ruth Bellamy has fully released to Nora as of today. Second, regarding the custodial trust originally established for both grandchildren, our review of banking records shows a pattern of withdrawals from Nora's portion totaling $1,500 to $8,400 directed toward expenses associated with Tyler's athletic activities, authorized by Denise and Richard Bellamy as co-trustees. That pattern may constitute a breach of fiduciary duty under Ohio law. Nora has not yet decided whether to pursue a formal accounting demand, but she has asked me to preserve all records in case she does. My father's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. My mother was crying now, the kind of crying that doesn't care who's watching her shoulders shaking slightly with each breath. And regarding the Main Street property, Martin continued his tone unchanged, professionally, neutral, even as the words landed like small detonations around the table. Nora, as owner, will need to formally decide on lease terms going forward. I'd recommend a private conversation with your father about that, separate from tonight once emotions have had time to settle. The call ended. Nobody at the table moved for several seconds. Somewhere near the back of the hall, the DJ Oblivious started playing something upbeat for the next scheduled dance, and the mismatch between the music and the silence at our table felt almost unbearable. Then Tyler stood up, chair scraping loudly. "I've spent 4 years thinking I mattered more than her," he said, his voice breaking on the word mattered. "You spent her college money on my coach. You told her science sewing whatever wasn't practical while you were literally stealing from her to pay for cleats." He turned to our father. "And she still owns the roof over your store. She could have said nothing. She could have let you keep believing you built all of this yourself. She didn't have to tell us any of it." Aunt Carol spoke up next, quiet but firm, setting down her fork like she needed both hands free for what she was about to say. "Richard, you need to sit with that for a minute." My cousin Melissa, crying openly, now added, "She's 20. She built a company and you two spent her inheritance on baseball camps." Even my mother's own sister, Aunt Linda, who rarely said anything critical at family gatherings, especially not about her own sister, said softly, "Denise, I think you owe her more than an explanation tonight. I think you owe her 4 years of one." Uncle Rick, my father's younger brother, who'd been quiet through most of dinner, finally spoke, his voice low. "Richard, I've known you my whole life. I never once thought you'd let something like this happen under your own roof." My father didn't answer him either. My father said nothing at all through most of it. He just sat there, staring at the space where the phone had been, like the whole room had rearranged itself without his permission, and he was still waiting for someone to hand him back the version of the evening he'd planned for. I didn't pursue the fiduciary breach claim, not formally, not yet. Martin structured a private repayment agreement instead, $1,500 to $8,400 over 4 years quietly, without a courtroom. I did decide, with Martin's help, to formalize the lease at 214 Main Street on fair market terms in writing, ending the informal arrangement that had let my father believe for years that some faceless company was simply generous with its pricing out of luck. The first 2 weeks after the dinner were strange in a way I hadn't expected. My parents called constantly, not angry exactly, more disoriented, my mother asking questions she should have asked years ago, like what a fell stitch actually was, or whether Carla had health insurance through the business. She showed up at my apartment once unannounced with a box of old photographs from the attic, me at 8, at Grandma Ruth's table, needle in hand, tongue sticking out in concentration in nearly every frame. She said she'd forgotten how many Sundays had gone into that table before any of it turned into something real. We sat together on my living room floor and went through the whole box almost an hour, mostly in silence, the kind of silence that felt less like avoidance and more like two people finally looking at the same thing at the same time for once. My mother apologized 3 weeks later over coffee at the diner where I still worked 1 shift a week out of loyalty to my manager, Deb, who'd given me my first job at 16. It wasn't a complete apology. She still framed some of it as we didn't know how to support something we didn't understand, but it was a start. And I let it be enough for that day, the way Grandma Ruth used to say some seams you finish later, once the fabrics had time to settle. My father took until November. He came to my workspace above the bakery, looked at the racks of finished garments at Carla, working quietly in the corner, and picked up a jacket, running his thumb along a seam, like he was seeing fabric for the first time in his life. I should have asked what you were building, he said, instead of assuming I already knew everything worth knowing. He stayed almost an hour longer than he'd spent in that space combined across every visit before it. It wasn't everything. It was something, and it was more than I'd expected from him. Tyler and I talk more now than we ever did before that night. He still pitches, still hopes for a scholarship somewhere modest and real, but he asks about my company now, genuinely the way a brother should have all along. He came by in October, sat on a crate, watched me hem a jacket for an hour in near silence. Before he left, he said the only thing that mattered: I get why you built it in the dark. I just wish you hadn't had to. He also told me that same visit, something I hadn't known, that he'd overheard our parents arguing quietly in the kitchen back in July. My mother saying she was starting to worry the trust account wouldn't hold up if anyone ever looked closely. My father telling her not to worry, that nobody ever would. Tyler said he hadn't understood what they meant at the time. He understood now, and it clearly weighed on him more than he wanted to admit out loud. I kept Grandma Ruth's letter framed beside her thimble in a small glass case in the workspace above the bakery, the same workspace whose lease now runs through me instead of a stranger nobody ever thought to question. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever built something real while the people who raised you called it worthless, tell me what they couldn't see. I want to know we're not alone in this. My family spent years believing loud dreams were the only ones worth funding, and quiet ones were worth stealing from. It took one phone call, one letter, and one deed with my name already on it to prove exactly whose hands had been holding the whole thing up the entire time. Small hands make big things, Grandma Ruth used to say, and for years I thought that was just a kind thing an old woman told a child to keep her at the sewing table a little longer. I know better now. It was never a comfort. It was a prediction, and she'd been patient enough to wait for it to come true, even after she wasn't there to see it happen herself.